It's January of 1692, and there's something very wrong with 9-year-old Betty Parris. Her father, the minister Samuel Parris, rushes to her bedside. Betty screams. Her body writhes under the blankets, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. She grunts, she moans, she snorts and shrieks. She grabs a candle from the bedside table and hurls it across the room, uttering a shrill scream as if defending herself from some invisible apparition. Soon, Betty's 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams is similarly afflicted. The girls are tormented, tortured, terrified. But by what? Parris calls in a doctor who takes one look at their bizarre behavior and quickly makes up his mind. This is the devil's work. When accusations and confessions of witchcraft follow soon after, the snowball begins its descent, growing and growing as it rolls into one of the most haunting events in American history. But what caused the madness of the Salem Witch Trials? There were no witches in Salem. How did the peculiar outbursts of a 9-year-old girl lead to the deaths of 25 innocent people and 2 dogs? Was it conspiracy, insanity, unchecked patriarchy, religion gone wrong? Was it food poisoning? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shayla Fontaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. I touched on the Salem Witch Trials briefly back in episode 8 about mass hysteria, and again in episode 29 about witches. But I've had a few people reach out to me asking for an episode dedicated exclusively to this event. And while the story of the Salem Witch Trials isn't actually about witches, it's pretty dang spooky. It is Spooktober on History Fix, after all month long. By the way, if you haven't listened to episode 29 about witches, that was from last Spooktober, you really, really should. It's probably one of my favorite episodes, and it really explains how this whole witch paranoia, witch hunting thing got started in Europe around the time of the Protestant Reformation. There are a lot of factors involved, but what really set it all off was the Catholic Church being threatened for the first time since it had become the official religion of the Roman Empire in 381. So we're talking about an over 1,000-year uninterrupted reign of dominance in Europe. And now people are starting to become dissatisfied. I mean, look at Rodrigo Borgia from a few weeks ago, who would become Pope Alexander VI in 1492. The man was far from a saint, and everyone knew it. So they start to go, this guy sucks. He's super corrupt and abusive. Why are we listening to him? He doesn't even practice what he preaches. This is a scam. The Catholic Church is a scam. And so begins the Protestant Reformation. And also, so begins the witch hunts and burnings and hangings all over Europe, but mostly in countries like Germany, where we see the Catholic and Protestant churches butting heads the most. The churches used witch hunts to appear strong and necessary during uncertain times. Like, look, there's this evil in the world, real evil. The devil is here, and he has these women, these witches working for him, and they are doing his bidding, and only we can protect you from them. You need us. And this led to a frenzy of fear that resulted in the deaths of up to 80,000 innocent people, mostly women. The Salem Witch Trials took place in 1692, and that was actually quite late for witch trials. But a lot of the same factors came into play here, and sort of like a microcosm, like all of what was happening in Europe a century or so earlier, but in a petri dish. So set the stage here. It gets a little confusing because if you were to visit Salem, Massachusetts, that's not actually where this all went down. At the time, in 1692, there was a place called Salem Town. That's Salem, Massachusetts today. And then nearby, there was another place called Salem Village. Salem Village today is called Danvers, Massachusetts, and that's where this all went down. So if you want to do like a Salem Witch Trials tour or something, make sure you go to Danvers, not Salem. I mean, you can go to Salem too because some of the trials happened there, but Danvers is where this started, Salem Village. But let's go back even farther, because this was all part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was an English colony. So we know Spain was all over the Caribbean, South America, Central America, Mexico. Let's recap the early English colonies real quick, starting with the failed Roanoke colony of 1587. That was the first attempt. Didn't take. That's episodes 27 and 28. Next comes Jamestown in Virginia, started in 1607. This one barely made it. They were eating people. That's how much it almost didn't make it. But it did. It survived, and it became the first permanent English colony. That's episode 24. After that, we have the Plymouth colony of Thanksgiving fame. This one was established in 1620 in southeastern Massachusetts, episode 36. So we're working our way up the coast, North Carolina, Virginia. Now we're in Massachusetts. Must have liked it, despite way harsher winters, because the next group goes there too, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The particular group that would later found Salem Village arrived in 1626 at Namkyog, which was a traditional Native American fishing site. They're like, cool, looks nice, we'll take it, y'all go fish somewhere else. And this was like an outpost of the greater Massachusetts Bay Colony. The group who settled here were mostly Puritans, looking for religious freedom and to establish basically a utopia for other Puritans in the colonies. They were called Puritans because they hoped to purify the Church of England, which was Protestant, started by Henry VIII so he could divorce his wife and marry his mistress. They hoped to purify it by getting rid of all leftover remnants of Catholic influences and religious practices, which were still lingering. So they arrived in Namkyog and they renamed it Salem, which comes from Jerusalem. So they arrive, they kick the indigenous residents out, they set up shop, hoping to form this utopian Puritan paradise. But over the next few decades, unsurprisingly, things do not go very well. There was a civil war back in England in the mid-1600s, in which the crown was overthrown by Parliament, and the king, Charles I, was beheaded. He's in the same tomb as Henry VIII, by the way. I have a mini fix about that. After that, Oliver Cromwell ruled for a time as Lord Protector of England. They didn't have a king for 11 years. But then they sort of found a happy medium. They brought the monarchs back. They just didn't have absolute power like they used to have. Parliament played a much larger political role, which let's not let one guy make all the decisions for the whole country. That's crazy. So poor beheaded Charles' son, Charles II, is placed on the throne. They're like, whoops, never mind. Sorry, we murdered your dad. And then there's another little scuffle in 1689 when Catholic King James II is replaced by William and Mary. And all of this political turmoil and upheaval back in England is affecting the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's messing with their charter, it's stripping the constitutional authority of their rulers, and it's changing up the dynamics of the colony itself. It's becoming less and less a Puritan colony. It's becoming a colony of merchants who want to sell cash crops and trade goods and whatnot. And for the Puritans who remain, whose only focus is religion, that's kind of scary. But there's a lot of other scary things happening too. Remember the Native Americans they kicked out? They're not happy about that. So there are a lot of conflicts between colonists and indigenous people, a lot of violence. In 1675, we have King Philip's War. I talked about this in episode 36 about Thanksgiving. This was an incredibly violent conflict between indigenous people and the descendants of those who settled the Plymouth colony. The folks who sat down for that first Thanksgiving, their grandchildren are now massacring each other. It was incredibly traumatic for both sides. So just keep in mind that quite a few of the people involved in the Salem Witch Trials had watched loved ones be brutally murdered, mothers, fathers, children, during King Philip's War. We're talking serious trauma that we now know greatly affects mental health. On top of that, there are smallpox epidemics happening. There's terrible weather, super dry summers leading to crop failure, super cold winters making everything suck. And then when William and Mary take the throne in 1689, they start a war with France, which has colonies just to the north. So if you're a British colonist living in the Northeast, you now have Native Americans and the French attacking you. And this drove many of them out of their settlements to the north as like refugees, and many of them went to Salem Village. This put a lot of pressure on Salem Village. There were limited resources to begin with. Now all these outsiders are flooding in, and some of them aren't even Puritans. They're diluting the Puritanism of the colony, and they're using up the resources, and they're eating the cats and dogs. I'm kidding. That was a joke. And if you didn't get it, you didn't watch the most recent U.S. presidential debate. No, they were not eating the cats and dogs, but they were making people uncomfortable. They were creating competition for resources and stirring up fears, threatening religion, and an already incredibly traumatized community. And this is the Petri dish. This is the microcosm of almost exactly what was happening in Europe at the time of the witch hunts of yesteryear. This is a recipe for witch hunts. On top of that, there's this rivalry between Salem Village, which was a pretty rural farming community, and neighboring Salem Town, which was larger and more affluent. There's competition there. And just within Salem Village itself, the people are just arguing all the time. There's a lot of tension. They're arguing over property lines, where livestock are allowed to graze, privileges within the church. They are gossipy and just mean to each other. They're not very neighborly. They have a lot of enemies, and they're very selfishly motivated. And I think that's just sort of what happens when you put humans in these sorts of dire situations. Past trauma, competition for resources, impending doom from disease, possible famine, and nearby fighting, violence, warfare, and a loss of control as the colony's Puritan leadership is threatened by political changes over in England. They start picking each other apart, tearing each other down. There's a lot of division. And then we have to look at what life as a Puritan was like, what Puritans believed, how they lived. Super, super strict expectations for how people should be. A lot of judgment. The constant threat of being ostracized by the community for the slightest infraction, which is so ironic because it's literally the opposite of what Christianity teaches, but whatever. This is an incredibly patriarchal society. Women had very few rights. They were not supposed to voice their opinions. They were seen and not heard, docile servants to their fathers and then their husbands. And in this sect of Christianity, there was a firm belief, verging on paranoia, that the devil was at work and that the devil could use people to do his bidding. And while men and women were viewed as equal in the eyes of God, they were not equal in the eyes of the devil. Puritans believed that the devil could more easily persuade and use women to do his bidding because they were weak and impressionable. Puritan women themselves knew that they were more prone to the devil's temptation. They were taught to fear this. They were taught to question themselves constantly. Were they acting for the devil? Had he gotten to them? Were they doing his bidding without even realizing it? Serious gaslighting. And Native Americans were definitely associated with the devil. They weren't Christian. They were godless. And in the eyes of the colonists, that aligned them with the devil. And these bloody conflicts with nearby Native American groups, King Philip's War just over a decade before, this had to have felt like the devil pressing in. And the Puritan leaders struggled to protect their flocks. And it's this world in which we find Betty Parris, 9 years old, writhing and screaming and throwing things. Betty Parris, the daughter of the first ever ordained minister in Salem Village, Samuel Parris, who was himself a very controversial figure. Back in 1672, Salem Village had decided to appoint their own minister, separate from Salem Town. They went through 3 of them quite quickly: James Bailey, George Burroughs, who we'll come back to because he'll become one of the 25 victims, believe it or not, and Deodat Lawson. None of them stuck around, probably because the people of Salem Village just kind of sucked. They were mean, right? Then along comes Samuel Parris. and the people are firmly divided over him. Some of them love him, some of them hate him. He divided the town further, and he intentionally stirred up more drama, pointing out minor infractions within the congregation and making people suffer humiliating public punishment for them. He's a bit of a bully, hiding beneath the guise of a holy man of God. And interestingly, it's his daughter and his niece who start the witch hunt. But it wasn't just those two. Soon, 12-year-old Ann Putnam also started having these, quote, fits. Anne was a Putnam, and the Putnams basically ran Salem Village. They owned most of the land, and they had most of the money. They were the it family in Salem Village, very influential. 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard soon joined in. Elizabeth was an orphan who worked as a maid in the house of her aunt and uncle. Her uncle, William Griggs, also happened to be the doctor, we believe, who first suggested witchcraft. I know this is a small town, but I'm finding these connections quite interesting. So we now have 4 afflicted girls, and the doctor, the uncle of the 4th girl, is suggesting witchcraft. And the minister, the father of the first girl and the uncle of the second, is like, duh, of course. These girls, ages 9, 11, 12, and 17, are brought before the magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and Jonathan Hathorne, and questioned intensely. Who is doing this to you? Is someone in the village doing this? Who is it? Is it so-and-so? Give us a name. I'm sure the questioning is very suggestive and not at all factoring in that these are little girls in an incredibly patriarchal society who have not been allowed to even speak publicly before, being completely intimidated by men in positions of power. And so they come up with 3 names because they were forced to. The first is Tituba. Tituba was enslaved by Samuel Parris, Betty's father, the minister. She was an indigenous woman, likely from the Arawak community in what is today Venezuela. Parris had brought her back to Massachusetts from a trip to Barbados in 1680. Another they accused was Sarah Good. She was a homeless beggar, which made her prime pickings for witchcraft accusations. Her father had been a prosperous tavern owner, but he committed suicide and left no will. So she was forced to live on the streets, begging for food because women had no rights or means of supporting themselves. And the third was Sarah Osborne. People just didn't really like Sarah Osborne. She didn't regularly attend church, which rubbed them the wrong way. She had remarried an indentured servant, which was so not cool. And the town disapproved of her trying to control her son's inheritance from her previous marriage. They were basically all up in her personal business, and they didn't like it. So these ladies are hauled in before the magistrates now and interrogated for several days. And they're not following like modern interrogation practices. They're being treated very harshly. They are trying to force confessions, which they managed to do in the case of Tituba. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne maintain their innocence throughout the whole ordeal, but Tituba confesses. She says that the devil came to her and bid her serve him. She described black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, which what is this, brown bear, brown bear? She also described a tall man with white hair who wanted her to sign his book. She said she had signed the book, and so had Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne and 7 other witches who were trying to destroy the Puritans in Salem Village. And this confession was a mic drop for the magistrates. This confirmed for them that witches were at work in Salem. But of course, it was a forced confession and therefore completely made up. Tituba just told them what they wanted to hear because otherwise they were going to kill her. But this launched the village into a full-blown witch hunt frenzy, which began to spiral out of control. More girls became afflicted by these invisible specters. 16-year-old Mary Walcott was the daughter of Captain Jonathan Walcott, who led the Salem Village militia. She was also related to the Putnam family by marriage. Ann Putnam was her step-cousin. She also lived next door to Betty Parris, so she predictably joins right in making accusations. Mercy Lewis was 19 years old. She was an orphan who had witnessed the deaths of her parents in a Native American raid a few years before and now worked as a servant in the Putnam household. And Mary Warren was 20 years old. She worked as a servant in the household of John and Elizabeth Proctor, who I'll come back to. And as more and more girls joined in, screaming and shrieking and writhing and claiming that they were being pricked and prodded by invisible tormentors that only they could see, the accusations started to fly. Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, the first three accused, were being held in jail. But more and more names started to emerge. Martha Corey, who had been openly skeptical about how credible the girls' accusations were, and soon found herself accused. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, who was interrogated by grown-ass men and forced to testify against her mother. She was imprisoned for 8 months. Yes, the 4-year-old. Elderly sisters Rebecca Nurse, Mary Esty, and Sarah Cloyce. Elizabeth Proctor, who employed one of the girls, Mary Warren, as a servant, and later her husband, John Proctor, when he stood up for his wife. Giles Corey, husband of Martha Corey, when he stood up for his wife. Now, I want to pause to point out, while the original 3 women accused were enslaved or poor or social outcasts, these people are not. Some of them are upstanding members of the community. Martha and Giles Corey and Rebecca Nurse were all fully covenanted members of the church. If they were being accused of witchcraft, truly no one was safe. William and Deliverance Hobbs and their teenage daughter Abigail are accused and arrested. Bridget Bishop, who had been acquitted of witchcraft charges 12 years earlier, making her an easy target. George Burroughs, who used to be the daggone minister of Salem Village before Parris. Mary Warren, one of the girls, John and Elizabeth Proctor's servant. She started acting all nuts, accusing people, and apparently after John Proctor, who was openly critical of all this, threatened to beat her if she didn't stop being so whack, she was like, okay, it's all fake. And then they accused her and threw her in jail too. Later, she hops back to the other side, accusing and testifying against the Proctors. Girl's nutty. More and more names pour out, and some of these people are confessing. And you may be asking, well, why would they do that? Why would so many of them confess to something they obviously did not do? Well, they're being tortured, first of all. These are forced confessions. But also, there's a chance some of them were led to believe that they really, truly had done the devil's bidding and allowed the devil to control them and force them to do things that maybe they didn't even remember. That was very much within the realm of Puritan beliefs, especially for women who were thought to be weaker and more easily tempted by the devil. And then, of course, there was the fact that they were not executing people who confessed, because everyone knew that the punishment for practicing witchcraft or consorting with the devil was death. But if they confessed, they would live. And so many confessed and then accused others, brought forth more and more names as accomplices, and this just pushed the snowball further and further down the hill. They're rounding all these people up over the next few months, interrogating them, throwing them in jail. This is quickly becoming a huge problem. Apparently half the village has been working for the devil, never mind the 7 witches Tituba initially informed them of. In May, the governor of the colony, William Phipps, orders a special court to convene to try all of these accused witches. A total of 62 now being held awaiting trial. Meanwhile, before she can be tried, Sarah Osborne, one of the original 3, dies in jail, the first casualty. And the magistrates, the court, the judge, they've never seen anything like this. They're reaching out to ministers all over the colony, seeking advice, seeking counsel, and one of them, who inserts himself quite boldly, is Cotton Mather. Mather was a very influential Puritan minister from Boston who wrote all sorts of books about witches and whatnot, just sort of stoking the Puritan devil paranoia further. But he actually cautions the court a bit, writing, quote, "Do not lay more stress on pure spectral evidence than it will bear. It is very certain that the devils have sometimes represented the shapes of persons not only innocent, but also very virtuous. Though I believe that the just God then ordinarily provides a way for the speedy vindication of the persons thus abused," end quote. As if he freaking knows anything. But what he's getting at here is that there is some disagreement about how credible spectral evidence is. So these girls, these afflicted girls, are claiming to see these people, like specters, like ghosts, sort of these real-life people appearing only to them and doing these horrible things. But are the people they're seeing really to blame, or is it trickery? History professor Kathleen M. Brown says in an article for Penn Today, quote, "If somebody says in court, 'I saw John Proctor and he was flying through the sky and he flew to so-and-so's window at night,' this would be entered into the courtroom as spectral evidence that John Proctor is in league with the devil and is a witch." Questioners began to wonder, if the devil can make somebody fly, could the devil make you think that you saw them fly? End quote. Meaning John would have had nothing to do with any of it. The devil just made the specter look like John. Because devils are dirty tricksters like that, right? So even Cotton Mather is cautioning them. Be careful relying too much on spectral evidence. It can be misleading. But they don't really listen. These witches are coming out of the woodwork. They gotta do something. Bridget Bishop is the first to be tried in June of 1692. She's the one who had been accused of witchcraft 12 years earlier and acquitted. So I guess they felt they had a pretty strong case against her. She was a repeat offender in their eyes. Evidence against Bridget included not living a Puritan lifestyle, wearing black clothing and, quote, odd costumes, and having a, quote, immoral lifestyle. She was indicted, tried, and convicted in one day, and was the first to be executed by hanging a week later. After Bridget's execution, the court took a 20-day break. They pumped the brakes a little bit. They write to all the ministers again to get advice, quote, upon the state of things as they then stood, end quote. They're like, whoa, this is getting real. We just killed somebody. Are we doing this right? Mather writes them back this huge, long 8-point bulletin I will not read to you because you will literally fall asleep, but he basically gives them the go-ahead to carry on, concluding in point 8, quote, "Nevertheless, we cannot but humbly recommend unto the government the speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious, according to the direction given in the laws of God and the wholesome statutes of the English nation for the detection of witchcrafts." End quote. Side note, when Mather reprinted this letter 2 years later, he omitted that part I just read to you, I assume to remove his own guilt in what would happen next. Because just as he advised them, they do carry on with the trials. But not everybody's feeling it. One of the judges, Major Nathaniel Saltonstall, resigned from the court after they got that letter from Cotton Mather. He's like, nope, y'all are delusional, I'm out. Making him the only one on the court who openly condemned the thing from the start. The rest of them just went along with it. But with Mather's blessing, they get back to work. Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse are all tried, convicted, and hanged in July. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter remains in jail for an additional 4 months after her mother is killed. In August, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., George Burroughs, John Willard, Elizabeth Proctor, and John Proctor are all convicted and hanged, minus Elizabeth Proctor, who was pregnant at the time, and so her execution was delayed. Contemporary author Robert Califf writes of the execution of George Burroughs in his book More Wonders of the Invisible World, which was basically a denouncement of the Salem Witch Trials and a roast of Cotton Mather, whom he clearly despised. Quote, "Mr. Burroughs was carried in a cart with others through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech for the clearing of his innocency, with such solemn and serious expressions as were to the admiration of all present. His prayer, which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer, as witches were not supposed to be able to recite, was so well worded and uttered with such composedness, as such fervency of spirit, as was very affecting and drew tears from many, so that it seemed to some that the spectators would hinder the execution. The accusers said the black man, devil, stood and dictated to him. As soon as he was turned off, hanged, Mr. Cotton Mather, being mounted upon a horse, addressed himself to the people, partly to declare that he, Mr. Burroughs, was no ordained minister, partly to possess the people of his guilt, saying that the devil often had been transformed into the angel of light. And this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. When he, Mr. Burroughs, was cut down, he was dragged by a halter to a hole or grave between the rocks, about 2 feet deep. His shirt and breeches being pulled off and an old pair of trousers of one executed put on his lower parts. He was so put in, together with Willard and Carrier, that one of his hands and his chin and a foot of one of them was left uncovered." End quote. And if you remember, Burroughs had actually been a minister of Salem Village before Samuel Parris. He actually left that position because he wasn't being paid the agreed-upon salary. In September, Giles Corey, an 81-year-old man who was accused after sticking up for his wife Martha, was pressed to death under stones. Yes, you heard that correctly. This was not meant as a form of execution. It was actually supposed to just be torture, used for forcing someone to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, which he was refusing to do. But the man was 81 years old, and they took it too far, and he died. A few days later, 8 more people were hanged. By now, the number of accused was nearing 200 people. And guys, there are only like 500 to 600 people living in Salem Village. But then, in October, Governor Phipps gets cold feet. Well, actually, his wife gets accused of witchcraft, and he's like, okay, that's enough. This has gone on long enough. And he writes a letter to the powers that be back in London, quote, "I hereby declare that as soon as I came from fighting and understood what danger some of their innocent subjects might be exposed to if the evidence of the afflicted persons only did prevail, either to the committing or trying any of them, I did, before any application was made unto me about it, put a stop to the proceedings of the court, and they are now stopped till their majesties' pleasure be known." End quote. And so the court was adjourned. For the most part, a few more people were indicted and tried, but there were no more executions. I guess they should have accused the governor's wife sooner. Who knew? That's all it took. Heck, throw Cotton Mather in the mix. Let's throw his name out there. In the end, 19 people were executed. 1 was pressed to death, and another 5 died in prison awaiting trial. 78% of the accused were women, and most of the men were only accused for trying to protect their wives or daughters. Most of the court cases that happened after Governor Phipps got cold feet ended in not guilty verdicts. No one else was executed, and the accused were eventually let go after they paid their jail fees. Can y'all believe that? These innocent people were wrongfully imprisoned for months, and they had to pay the dang jail fees to get out. That is bananas. They were declared innocent by the court, and they still had to pay the jail fees. Wow. But you know what else is really crazy? How long it took those who were convicted and executed to be exonerated. Because their families and descendants, they pretty much immediately started trying to clear their names, like back in the 1690s. But you guys, they were not officially exonerated by the state of Massachusetts until 2003. They had even had a big 300-year commemoration event in Salem and Danvers in 1992, and they didn't do it then. Didn't think to be like, hey, you know what? Those people weren't actually witches. They were completely innocent. Maybe we should make that official. Nope. Needed a bit more than 300 years to figure that out. Took them 310. Sort of. Because somehow they left someone out. The Massachusetts legislature passed an act in 2003 exonerating everyone who was convicted and listing them each by name. But they forgot one, or something. They never listed Elizabeth Johnson, who was convicted but never executed. But she had been convicted. She still needed to be exonerated like everyone else. Technically, she was still a witch in the eyes of Massachusetts law. And it was actually an 8th grade civics class that noticed this anomaly and fought for her exoneration, which she finally got in 2022. Yes, 2 years ago. So what the heck happened? Because this all started with a couple of little girls acting a fool and being pressured into accusing community members of witchcraft. How does that happen? That's quite a leap. And there are several theories that try to explain it. One of them is more conspiratorial, that a lot of this was intentional and even strategic. Because a lot of these accusations, the majority of these accusations were coming one way or another from the Putnam family. Remember I said the Putnams were like the it family of Salem. They were the wealthiest. They owned the most land. They had a lot of influence. And they had an all-out feud with another family in the village, the Porters. This rivalry was so intense, literally the whole village was torn between the Putnams and the Porters. Which side are you on? According to the Salem Witch Trials Wikipedia page, quote, citizens would often have heated debates, which escalated into full-fledged fighting, based solely on their opinion of the feud, end quote. And remember, Ann Putnam was one of the afflicted girls. She was the third one to become afflicted. And she made more accusations than any of them. More than 60 people she personally named as witches. And her father, Thomas Putnam, was super involved too. He was one of the greatest instigators, ringleaders of the whole thing. He wrote many of the depositions for the girls, which were used in the trials as evidence against the accused. And so some speculate that this was a convenient way to dispose of their enemies. Anne would later apologize for her involvement, by the way, but only when she needed to get something out of it. According to History.com, quote, in 1706, while seeking to join the Salem Village Church, Anne offered the only known apology of any of the Salem accusers, stating that she had been deluded by the devil and that she desired, quote, to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness from God and from all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, end quote. She was allowed to join the congregation, but died from unknown causes just 9 years later. End quote. But I don't know, maybe the conspiracy theory makes sense for Thomas Putnam, but not really for the others. It didn't start with Ann Putnam anyway. It started with Betty Parris. And her father, the minister, had nothing to gain from Tituba, the woman he enslaved, being accused of witchcraft. In fact, they basically fled the town after this. Betty never participated in any of the trials. Her parents sent her away to stay with family. Her father, Samuel Parris, was dismissed as minister and took the rest of the family off to where Betty was already hiding. So it's not like Putnam and Parris sat down together and were like, how do we get rid of all these undesirables standing in our way? I know, get the girls in here. We're going to need them for this. It wasn't like that. I don't think Thomas Putnam played a role in starting the madness, and I don't see any reason why Samuel Parris would. It didn't stand to benefit him at all. But I do think Thomas Putnam took advantage of the madness once it had started. He finessed it in certain directions that were convenient for him. Another, more recent theory is quite interesting. This one suggests that there may have been an actual physical cause for the girls' strange behavior, ergotism. This is a form of food poisoning, basically, that comes from eating ergot, which is a type of fungus that grows on grains, especially rye. So the theory is that the girls were ingesting this ergot by eating moldy bread, and that they developed ergotism. So the symptoms of ergotism, which is also called St. Anthony's fire or devil's curse, include convulsions, muscle spasms, vomiting, hallucinations, and pain. Pretty similar to what these girls were experiencing, and also pretty scary. And if that's happening to you and you don't know why, and someone, a doctor even, suggests that witches are doing it to you, you're going to be like, okay, yeah, it's witches, now make it stop, right? What do I have to do to make it stop? Especially if you're a 9-year-old Puritan girl in the 1600s and you don't know any better. But then, if it's ergotism, like, why is only this small group of girls getting it? Are they all eating the same bread and no one else is eating that bread? It doesn't really make much sense logistically. And so what most experts seem to land on is that the Salem witch trials were a clear-cut case of mass hysteria. Something super complicated that, like many things concerning the human mind, we don't fully understand. But we've seen other examples of this. Schoolgirls laughing uncontrollably for days, dancing epidemics where people start dancing and literally cannot stop, dance until they drop dead of exhaustion. And in this case, we see young girls not laughing, not dancing, but screaming and writhing and contorting their bodies, acting possessed. And nothing is wrong with them. Nothing is happening to them, but they can't stop and they don't know why they're doing it. And it seems to spread as mass hysteria does. Another girl hears about it. Did you hear about Betty Parris and Abigail and Ann Putnam? Did you hear what's happening to them? And then all of a sudden she's doing it too, and she doesn't know why, and she can't stop. And when we study cases of mass hysteria, there's a pattern that emerges. This phenomenon happens when communities are under great stress. Extreme tension from disease or famine, fighting, violence, competition for resources, church-driven fear, basically all of the things that were happening in Salem. It's a recipe for mass hysteria. And so that explains the girls' behavior. I mean, we don't really understand it, but we know it's a thing, mass hysteria, and it does explain their behavior. But a handful of girls acting wacky isn't enough to execute 20 people. Kathleen Brown says in Penn Today, quote, "This outbreak resulted in the executions of accused witches because local magistrates and clergymen pour gasoline on the fire. The elite leadership of very learned clergymen and local magistrates of the courts were definitely on board with this. Otherwise, the accusations would have remained just that, accusations. With local people baking witch cakes and putting little locks of hair inside a frying pan of urine to see if somebody really was a witch or not. But you wouldn't have had people tried. You wouldn't have had the gathering of testimony, and you wouldn't have all the documentation if all of the legal apparatus and the expertise of clergymen hadn't been brought to bear." End quote. But this can be explained as well. It's no different than what was happening all over Europe in the 14, 15, 1600s, especially in Germany, where 40% of the, quote, witches were burned. In Germany, where the newly formed Protestant church was threatening the Catholic Church for the first time. And in Salem, where the Puritan church, a Puritan colony, was being diluted by outsiders, more concerned with trade and enterprise than with reading their Bibles. When the church feels threatened, it invents a villain only it can defend its people against. And it so badly needs them to believe in this villain and in its power to protect them from it that it kills innocent people, upstanding members of society even, members of the church, past ministers of the church. That's how badly they need this to be real. Because if it's not real, then what good are they anyway? Who needs them? Your perception becomes your reality, you guys. And a perception driven by fear and suspicion, paranoia and hate is a truly terrifying reality that leads to really dangerous and damaging actions. And not to get political, I know everything is annoyingly political right now in the US, at least, but I see this perception among certain factions today. And it's possible that my eating cats and dogs joke from earlier wasn't as funny as it is scary. Spooktober indeed. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from History.com, Smithsonian Magazine, the Peabody Essex Museum, Penn Today, and Wikipedia. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.